You ever notice how the person who once loved deeply slowly becomes the one who no longer feels safe loving at all? How warmth turns into silence and presence turns into distance? This is not just heartbreak. This is transformation, and not the kind you asked for. Listen closely, because what you become in love that lacks safety can either destroy you or awaken you. There is a strange law in emotional connection that most people never understand until it is too late. We do not remain unchanged in the presence of inconsistent love. We adapt, we survive. And in survival, we begin to reshape ourselves into something unrecognizable. Avoidant psychology is not just about the one who pulls away, it is also about the one who stays too long, trying to prove they are not too much, not too needy, not too emotional. But in that trying, something sacred begins to break. You start shrinking your truth just to fit into someone else's emotional limitations. At first, you love openly, express, you reach, you give without calculation. But every time your warmth is met with distance, every time your vulnerability is met with silence, something shifts inside you, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a door slowly closing within your own chest. And then one day, you realize you are no longer the one who reaches first. You are no longer the one who explains, who expresses, who hopes out loud. You have become measured, controlled, emotionally unavailable in ways you once swore you would never be. And that is the irony. You became everything they were afraid you would be, not because you lacked love, but because your love was not held safely. But understand this is not your final form. This is not your identity. This is adaptation under emotional pressure. And anything that is learned can be unlearned. The deeper truth is this: love was never meant to force you into emotional exile. It was never meant to make you question your softness. Real love does not require are you to become distant in order to feel safe. So the question is no longer, why did they pull away? The real question is, what did I become while trying not to lose them? Because awareness is the beginning of return. Return to softness. Return to openness. Return to the version of you that did not need emotional armor just to be loved. And when you get there, you will realize you were never too much. You were just never met where you were. Avoidant behavior is often rooted in fear of emotional dependency and vulnerability. And to truly understand this, you have to look beneath the surface of what people show and into what they protect. Most avoidant patterns do not begin as rejection of others, they begin as protection of self. Somewhere in a person's emotional history, closeness stopped feeling safe. Love may have been inconsistent, attention may have been conditional, or emotional expression may have been met with criticism, neglect, or withdrawal. Over time, the nervous system learns a simple but powerful equation. If I get too close, I get hurt. And once that equation is learned, it quietly begins to govern behavior in adulthood, even when the present situation is different. This fear of emotional dependency is not about not needing anyone at all. It is about the terror of needing someone and not being held. So the avoidant mind builds a strategy. Stay independent, stay self-contained, stay slightly out of reach. On the outside, this can look like strength, confidence, even emotional maturity. But internally, it is often a tightly controlled emotional system that is constantly scanning for signs of intrusion, expectation, or loss of autonomy. The moment intimacy deepens, something inside them tightens, not because they don't care, but because caring begins to feel like risk. Vulnerability in this framework is not experienced as connection, it is experienced as exposure. And exposure feels dangerous when past experiences have taught the heart that openness leads to pain. So instead of leaning in, the avoidant response is to pull back, to create space, to regulate emotions through distance. This is why you may see someone who can be warm one moment and distant the next. It is not randomness, it is internal regulation. When emotions rise too high, when expectations feel too close, when attachment begins to form, the system activates its defense: emotional withdrawal. But what makes this pattern so complex is that avoidant individuals are not emotionless. In fact, many feel deeply, sometimes even more intensely than others. The difference is not the absence of emotion, but the difficulty in staying with it when it involves dependence on another person. So they learn to rely on themselves, to solve alone, to process alone, to endure alone. And in doing so, they unconsciously reinforce the belief that self-sufficiency is safety and closeness is danger. This fear also shapes how relationships are experienced from the inside. When someone NS to rely on them emotionally, it can trigger an internal conflict. Part of them desires connection, while another part interprets that connection as a potential loss of freedom or control. This push and pull dynamic is often mistaken for lack of interest, but in reality, it is an internal struggle between attachment and fear. The more emotionally significant the relationship becomes, the more intense this internal tension can feel. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. The person no longer consciously decides to withdraw, they simply feel overwhelmed and instinctively create distance. They may not even have language for what they are feeling, only a sense of discomfort, pressure, or suffocation when emotional closeness increases. And so distance becomes their emotional language, not because they do not value love, but because they have not learned how to remain within it without feeling unsafe. At its core, avoidant psychology is not a rejection of connection, it is a protection against the pain that connection once carried. They withdraw not because you are unworthy, but because closeness triggers internal emotional discomfort, and this is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in avoidant psychology. From the outside, withdrawal often looks personal. It feels like rejection, like you are not enough, like something in you failed to hold their attention or keep their presence. But in many avoidant patterns, the movement away from intimacy has less to do with the partner's value and more to do with the internal alarm system that closeness activates within them. When emotional proximity increases, it can stir a deep, often unconscious discomfort that is difficult to articulate, so it expresses itself through distance. To understand this, you have to see that closeness is not experienced the same way by everyone. For someone with secure attachment, intimacy can feel grounding, stabilizing, and nourishing. But for someone with avoidant conditioning, closeness can feel like pressure building inside a closed space. Not because the other person is doing something wrong, but because their nervous system associates emotional merging with a loss of autonomy or emotional control. The moment connection starts to deepen through consistent affection, emotional availability, or expectations of reciprocity, the internal system begins to activate its protective mechanisms. This discomfort is not always conscious. The avoidant person may not think, I need to pull away now. Instead, they may simply feel restless, irritated, overwhelmed, or suddenly detached. Small things that once felt pleasant can start to feel demanding. Messages may feel heavier, conversations more intense, expectations more visible. Even love itself can begin to feel like a space where they are being asked to be emotionally exposed in ways they are not equipped to sustain. So, withdrawal becomes a way to regulate that internal pressure. It is important to understand that this withdrawal is not always a decision, it is often a reflex. A learned emotional response shaped by earlier experiences where closeness may have led to disappointment, inconsistency, or emotional engulfment. In such cases, the mind encodes a survival rule: distance equals safety. So when intimacy rises in the present, the body responds with the old solution, even if the present situation is different. This is why avoidant individuals can sometimes feel confused by their own behavior. Part of them may genuinely care, even feel attachment, while another part instinctively pulls away to restore emotional equilibrium. What makes this even more complex is that they may experience guilt or confusion after withdrawing. They might not fully understand why they suddenly feel the need to disconnect, especially if the relationship is healthy or loving. But emotional safety is not always rational, it is physiological. The nervous system does not always distinguish between past and present threats, so closeness itself becomes the trigger, not because it is harmful, but because it resembles emotional states where vulnerability once led to discomfort or loss of control. From the partner's perspective, this can feel deeply personal. When affection is met with distance, the natural interpretation is often I did something wrong or I am too much. But in avoidant dynamics, the withdrawal is often less about the partner's behavior and more about the internal threshold of emotional tolerance being exceeded. There is a point at which intimacy stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like emotional saturation. And when that threshold is crossed, distancing becomes the only way they know how to restore balance. This does not mean their actions are painless or without consequence. The impact on the partner can still be deeply wounding, but understanding the mechanism behind it changes the narrative. It shifts the story from personal inadequacy to emotional conditioning. They are not necessary. Lie running from you to they are often running from the intensity of what closeness awakens inside them, a discomfort they have never fully learned to stay with, process, or regulate while remaining connected. Repeated emotional inconsistency does not just hurt in the moment, it slowly reshapes how a person experiences love, attachment, and even their own identity. At first, you think you are simply reacting to someone else's behavior. You tell yourself you are adapting, being patient, being understanding. But over time, those repeated cycles of closeness and withdrawal begin to rewire your emotional expectations. Your nervous system stops operating from trust and starts operating from prediction. You begin to anticipate distance even when love is present, and you begin to brace for absence even in moments of connection. This is how identity starts to shift quietly. You do not notice the change as a single event. There is no clear moment where you wake up and realize you are different. It happens in fragments. You send a message and wait longer than you should for a reply. You feel the sting of silence and tell yourself not to expect too much. You receive warmth one day and withdrawal the next, and you begin to adjust your emotional expression accordingly. You become more careful, more measured, more selective with your vulnerability. Not because that is your natural state, but because inconsistency teaches you that openness is risky. Over time, your emotional reactions begin to mirror the environment you are in. When love is unpredictable, you become unpredictable within yourself. One part of you still longs deeply, still reaches, still hopes. Another part begins to shut down, to protect, to withdraw before you can be withdrawn from. This internal split is not random, it is adaptation. The mind tries to reduce pain by preparing for it in advance. So you stop leaning fully into connection. You start keeping one foot out the door emotionally, even when you physically, at least stay. This is where survival-based identity begins to form. You no longer respond from a place of secure emotional expression. Instead, you respond from a place of emotional management. You start asking yourself questions like, how much should I give today? Will I seem too attached if I express this? Should I wait so I don't look desperate? These questions are not signs of natural relational awareness. They are signs that your emotional system is trying to protect you from inconsistency by controlling exposure. And slowly, something even deeper happens. You begin to internalize the rhythm of inconsistency as if it is normal love. The moments of distance no longer shock you as much. The silence becomes familiar. The uncertainty becomes something you quietly adjust to. In some cases, consistency can even feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable because your system has learned to equate emotional unpredictability with attachment. This is how deeply repeated patterns can rewire perception. At the same time, your sense of self begins to shift. You may start to see yourself as someone who is too emotional, too needy, or too sensitive, not because those traits are inherently true, but because the environment you are in only rewards smaller versions of your expression. So you begin shrinking yourself in subtle ways. You stop sharing certain feelings. You delay expressing needs. You downplay your own emotional reality to avoid triggering withdrawal in the other person. And every time you do this, you reinforce the belief that your full emotional self is not safe to exist in connection. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it feels like adaptation, not loss. You believe you are learning how to love better, how to be more understanding, how to avoid conflict. But underneath, you are also learning how to disconnect from parts of yourself in order to maintain proximity to someone who is inconsistent. And in that process, your emotional identity slowly begins to align with the environment rather than your authentic nature. Eventually, you may notice that your reactions in other relationships begin to change too. You might become more guarded, more hesitant, more observant of emotional signals. You might struggle to fully trust even when someone is consistent. This is because your nervous system has been trained by repetition. It no longer responds to individual moments, it responds to patterns it has been forced to learn. This is how emotional inconsistency becomes identity shaping, not because you are meant to become guarded or distant, but because the mind is always trying to survive what it cannot predict. When love is not received safely, the mind begins to mirror avoidance as protection. And this transformation is often so gradual that you do not realize you are changing until you are already emotionally different. At the beginning, your natural instinct is openness. You express, you reach, you show care without overthinking. There is a softness in how you connect, a willingness to trust what you feel. But when that openness is repeatedly met with inconsistency, emotional absence, or withdrawal, something inside begins to learn that expression is not always safe. Not because love itself is unsafe, but because the way it is being received creates emotional unpredictability. The human nervous system is designed to protect you from emotional pain, not just physical harm. So when vulnerability leads to confusion, silence, or emotional disconnection, the mind starts building protective strategies. One of the most powerful of these strategies is mirroring. You begin to unconsciously replicate the emotional environment you are exposed to. If the environment is inconsistent, you begin to become inconsistent. If the environment is distant, you begin to become distant. not as a conscious choice, but as a form of emotional adaptation. At first, this mirroring is subtle. You might delay your responses a little longer than usual. Not because you want to, but because you are trying to regain a sense of control. You might stop expressing certain feelings immediately, choosing instead to wait and see how the other person behaves. You might begin to match their energy, giving less when they give less, not out of indifference, but as a way of protecting yourself from imbalance. This is where emotional self-protection begins to take the shape of emotional withdrawal. Over time, this adaptive behavior becomes internalized. You are no longer just reacting to them, you are becoming them emotionally. Their distance teaches you distance. Their silence teaches you restraint. Their inconsistency teaches you hesitation. And slowly, your natural expressive self begins to fade into a more guarded version of you. You start filtering your emotions before you even express them, asking yourself whether it is worth the risk. This filtering becomes automatic, a new emotional reflex. What is most significant here is that this mirror, roaring, does not feel like transformation at first. It feels like wisdom. It feels like maturity. You tell yourself you are learning not to overgive, not to overextend, not to be too available. But beneath that narrative, there is often a deeper shift happening. You are beginning to associate emotional safety with emotional limitation. You are learning that the less you feel outwardly, the less vulnerable you become to being hurt by someone else's inconsistency. As this continues, emotional mirroring becomes identity shaping. You start believing that you are naturally more guarded, more detached, more selective with your emotions. But in reality, these traits are often not who you are. They are who you had to become in response to emotional unpredictability. The mind adapts so well that it convinces you the adaptation is your personality. You begin to see your emotional distance as strength, when in truth, it may have begun as protection. There is also a deeper emotional consequence to this mirroring. As you begin to match avoidance, you may start losing access to your original emotional clarity. The part of you that once loved freely now has to pass through layers of caution before it can be expressed. You begin to second guess genuine feelings, not because they are unclear, but because you have learned that clarity does not always guarantee safety. So hesitation replaces flow, and emotional spontaneity is replaced by emotional calculation. This shift can also create internal conflict. One part of you still longs for closeness, still remembers what it felt like to love without fear. Another part insists on distance as protection. And in this internal division, you begin to feel emotionally split, wanting connection, but only within controlled limits. This is the quiet result of learning love in an unsafe emotional environment. Eventually, what you mirror long enough begins to feel like you. Not because it truly is you, but because repetition creates familiarity. And familiarity often disguises itself as identity. You don't just get her to slowly become what you were trying to escape. Distant, guarded, emotionally unavailable, and this is one of the most painful paradoxes of emotional experience. At the beginning, your intention is never to shut down. You do not enter love planning to lose your softness. You do not decide to become guarded. You enter with openness, with sincerity, with a willingness to connect deeply. But emotional environments have a way of shaping behavior over time, especially when safety is inconsistent. What starts as sensitivity eventually becomes protection. What starts as openness eventually becomes caution. And what starts as love eventually becomes emotional self-monitoring. The shift is rarely sudden. It begins in small moments where your emotional expression is not fully received, a message left unanswered, a feeling acknowledged late or not at all, a moment of vulnerability met with distance. Each of these experiences seems minor on its own, but the nervous system does not store them as isolated events. It stores them as patterns. And when a pattern suggests that openness leads to emotional uncertainty, the mind begins to adjust. Not to stop loving, but to reduce exposure. So you begin to hold back not everything, just enough to protect yourself. You start choosing what to share and what to keep inside. At first, it feels like emotional intelligence. It feels like maturity. You tell yourself you are learning boundaries. But slowly, the line between protection and suppression begins to blur. You are no longer just choosing wisely, you are beginning to withhold automatically. Emotional expression becomes something you calculate rather than something you naturally release. Over time, this carefulness becomes identity shaping. You start to believe you are naturally someone who does not need much, who does not express much, who prefers distance. But in many cases, this is not preference, it is adaptation. The emotional system has learned that closeness carries risk, so it minimizes attachment signals to avoid potential pain. You begin to feel more comfortable in emotional neutrality than in emotional intensity, not because neutrality is your nature, but because intensity has become associated with uncertainty. What makes this transformation so complex is that it does not feel like loss while it is happening. It feels like control. It feels like you are finally protecting your peace. But beneath that sense of control, something more subtle is occurring. You are disconnecting from the parts of you that once reached freely. The version of you that expressed without hesitation does not disappear all at once. It fades gradually, replaced by a version that is always observing, always evaluating, always preparing for the possibility of emotional withdrawal from others. This is how emotional unavailability is often formed, not through lack of feeling, but through repeated experiences that I'm feeling is unsafe to express fully. You still feel deeply, but you begin to contain it. You still care, but you start to regulate how much of that care is visible. You still want connection, but you approach it with caution, as if every step must be measured to avoid emotional risk. There is also an internal contradiction that develops during this process. One part of you remembers what it felt like to love openly without hesitation. That part still exists, still longs for closeness, still wants to trust without overthinking. But another part has been shaped by experience and insists on restraint. So you begin to live in a tension between openness and protection. You want connection, but only if it feels safe. And because safety has been inconsistent, your threshold for what feels safe becomes narrower over time. Eventually, what you once reacted to as pain becomes something you replicate in your own behavior. The distance you once feared becomes something you practice, the emotio. Now, withdrawal you once experienced from others becomes something you now initiate yourself. Not because it feels natural, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity, even when it is painful, often becomes the mind's chosen comfort. This is the quiet tragedy of emotional adaptation. You do not realize you are becoming distant while trying to avoid being hurt by distance. You only realize it when your own emotional presence feels harder to access, and the softness you once gave freely now feels like something you have to search for again. Healing begins when you stop reacting to their fear and start reclaiming your emotional truth. And this moment is not loud or dramatic, it is often quiet, almost invisible from the outside. It does not begin with a grand decision to change your life, but with a subtle internal recognition that you have been adjusting yourself around someone else's emotional limitations for too long. You begin to see that much of your emotional confusion did not come from lack of love, but from lack of consistency, lack of safety, and lack of clear emotional reciprocity. And in that recognition, something essential starts to return to you: awareness. When you are deeply entangled in avoidant dynamics or emotional inconsistency, your attention becomes outward facing. You are constantly monitoring the other person's availability, their tone, their distance, their silence, their return. Your emotional world becomes reactive. If they are close, you open. If they withdraw, you contract. If they are warm, you hope. If they are distant, you question yourself. Over time, this external focus slowly pulls you away from your own emotional center. You begin to lose track of what you feel independently of their behavior. Healing starts the moment you interrupt this pattern, not by forcing detachment, but by returning attention inward. You begin asking different questions. Instead of, why are they like this with me? You start asking, what is happening inside me? When I accept this pattern, instead of, how do I make them stay emotionally present? You begin asking, why do I feel the need to earn emotional consistency? These questions shift the direction of awareness from control to understanding. Reclaiming emotional truth means allowing yourself to feel what was previously minimized. It means acknowledging the disappointment you dismissed, the confusion you rationalized, the loneliness you normalized. Many people stay stuck not because they do not understand what is happening, but because they have learned to override their own emotional signals in order to maintain connection. Healing reverses that process. It teaches you to trust the signals again. At first, this can feel uncomfortable because emotional truth is not always convenient. It may reveal that you have been overextending. It may reveal that you have been tolerating inconsistency in the name of hope. It may reveal that you have been shrinking your needs to avoid abandonment. None of this is meant to create shame. It is meant to restore clarity, because you cannot change what you refuse to fully acknowledge. As you begin reclaiming your emotional truth, something important happens. The emotional authority you gave away starts to return. You are no longer as easily destabilized by someone else's distance. You begin to notice that their fear, their withdrawal, their inconsistency are not instructions for your behavior. They are reflections of their internal state, not definitions of your emotional worth. This distinction is foundational. Without it, you remain emotionally entangled in their reactions. With it, you begin to separate your identity from their patterns. Reclaiming truth also means rebuilding your relationship with expression. You start allowing yourself to say what you feel without excessive filtering, not impulsively, not without awareness, but without the heavy weight of self censorship that developed during inconsistency. You begin to understand that your emotions do not need perfect conditions to be valid. They simply need acknowledgement. And perhaps the most significant part of healing is this: you stop organizing your emotional world around avoiding abandonment. You begin organizing it around self respect. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop abandoning yourself in order to keep someone else close. You learn that closeness built on self erasure is not connection, it is compromise of identity. Over time, this shift changes how you experience relationships entirely. You no longer feel compelled to chase clarity from those who are inconsistent. You no longer feel responsible for managing someone else's fear of intimacy. You begin to understand that emotional availability cannot be negotiated into existence. It can only be met or it cannot. And in that understanding, something quietly powerful happens. You return to yourself, not the version of you shaped by fear or reaction or adaptation, but the version of you that existed before you started shrinking to fit emotional uncertainty. And so, as this truth settles within you, remember that what you became was never your final identity. It was your adaptation to emotional uncertainty, not your destiny. You are not meant to live in reaction to someone else's fear, but in alignment with your own emotional truth, your own depth, your own peace. Let go of the need to shrink in order to be chosen, and return to the wholeness that does not require permission to exist. Thank you for being here, for listening with openness, and for allowing these words to meet you where you are. Goodbye, and may you move forward with clarity, strength, and the quiet power of returning fully to yourself.